You know, I'm going to start with Iran and circle my way back to Iran, I think, is a good way to do an overview. The context of, I think it's fair to say, everything that we're looking at in the Middle East right now, the Iran nuclear situation, the Assad regime fighting for its life, killing tens of thousands of civilians, or thousands of civilians, the situation in Lebanon, the situation that Israel faces with Hezbollah and Hamas, everything is in some way connected or revolves around the Islamic revolution of Iran, the revolution of Ayatollah Khomeini. That revolution centers in what is called the Qum Madrasa, the school of thought that Khomeini is identified with at the city of Qom, as opposed to the Najaf Madrasa in Iraq. And I think it's important to understand the difference between those two as the context of everything that we're looking at here, because it really has so much strategic relevance. The Qum Madrasa believes in the principle of the Vilayat-e-Faqih, which is the identification of religious and political authority. It's a kind of constitutional principle. It says that the only legitimate source of political authority is religious authority. The only source of political legitimacy is the sanction of the religious leaders of the Qum Madrasa. That very dangerous political philosophy, which is, you can see, is dangerous to any constitution that's based on the principle of democracy or the democratic nation state, was from the very start supposed to be an expansionary worldwide revolution, sort of like what the Wahhabis and the Salafists have in mind. It's going for, you know, a restoration of the Muslim caliphate. And it was a dangerous enough political philosophy that Saddam Hussein, who has a majority, ruled over a majority Shiite country, even if it was Shiite Arab rather than Shiite Persian, invaded Iran preemptively. He was trying to preempt the Islamic revolution of Iran from gaining a foothold in his country. The good news is that the Islamic revolution of Iran has failed to gain a foothold anywhere outside of Iran, with one exception. The bad news is that the one exception where it has gained a foothold is Lebanon. And for Israel's situation and for our situation, what complicates it is Iran's alliance with Syria. Now, the Syria situation, we'll come back to Syria in a second, but the Syria situation is very interesting. Syria is a country that's majority Sunni Arab and minority Alawite. It's 16% Alawite, which is Assad's sect. And you'll hear in the news a lot of people say that the Alawites are an offshoot of Shia Islam. And I don't, it's funny to think about that. That's sort of like being a Mormon during the Spanish Inquisition and saying that you're an offshoot of Christianity or something. It doesn't really count from the point of view of fundamentalists that believe in the principle of that are takfiris, that believe that anybody who doesn't believe exactly what they believe can be killed and deserves to be killed. This is very important to understand, because if Assad was ruling over a country like Saddam Hussein's, which has a large population of Shiites, Syria would never have been allied to Iran, right? Because the whole principle of the Islamic revolution of Iran would have been inimical to Assad's entire claim to power. When you go to Lebanon, you see all over the place these yellow banners that have the image of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of the Hezbollah in Lebanon, next to a floating image of Ayatollah Khomeini and one or two of the other Ayatollahs in Iran. You see that the corrosive effect of the Islamic revolution in Lebanon is that it's destroying the legitimacy and the power of the Lebanese government, because even participating in the government of Lebanon, the way they do now, the Hezbollah doesn't recognize the political authority of the government of Lebanon. It recognizes the political authority of the clerics in Tehran. And so that's very dangerous from Israel's point of view, because Hezbollah has 30,000 rockets pointed directly at Israel, and will use them not when Palestinians are under fire in Gaza, but when the mullahs in Tehran need them to, which has important implications for the deterrent balance and the nuclear weapons issue. So when looking at Syria and the Syrian crisis that we have now, it's important to recognize that you're looking at the essential bridge of the Islamic Revolution's extension outside of Iran. The only place where it's been able to extend itself is Lebanon, and the only way that it's been able to do that is through the alliance with a regime that is not part of the Islamic Revolution of Iran. In that sense, the Assad regime ought to be a weak link. And because Syria doesn't have anything to fear from a common enemy in Iraq anymore, it doesn't really have a strategic reason to be allied to Iran in the first place. So what the Israelis hope, and have hoped for a lot ever since the fall of Saddam, is that sooner or later the link between Syria and Iran can be broken. And that's what we hope is the end game here. Now, when looking at what to do about the Syria situation, I think it's important we see a lot of consternation because the options aren't good. Should we arm the rebels? Should we give humanitarian assistance to the rebels? There have been some very testy encounters recently in the Foreign Relations Committee where resolutions that are, pretty innocuous resolutions about humanitarian assistance and so forth have been stripped in the committee because they went too far or because they were pointless or didn't do anything. So while everyone agrees that something ought to be done in Syria, here in Washington, for example, nobody agrees, or in the various capitals in the West, people don't agree on what it is that should be done in Syria. I think a very important first question to ask that isn't being asked is, what do we have a right to do in Syria? Because the administration has so far very helpfully reinforced the image that whatever we do, we have to go through the United Nations Security Council to do it. And that's a disastrous precedent that the world community, the international community, diplomats of the United Nations have tried to establish as a norm of international relations since the early 90s. It's purely a product of the post-Cold War world, and the only purpose is to constrain American power and to constrain America's range of options. And so this demonstration of outrage that Susan Rice gave in the Security Council several weeks ago when the Russians and Chinese vetoed the resolution on Syria was very counterproductive to the United States and very counterproductive to the people of Syria. What were we doing in the Security Council at all? I mean, it was clear months ago that the Russians at least would veto a resolution of any significance on Syria. Syria is not any kind of a gatekeeper for the exercise of American power. In the 1990s, it was easy enough. When the Russians made the mistake of telegraphing their intention to veto any resolution on Serbia too early, Clinton said, all right, fine, then we'll just go through NATO. And the issue never even came up at the Security Council. We never even tried to whip votes at the Security Council for a resolution authorizing force. You know, when you read back to the UN Charter, it started out as a very promising experiment. The purposes, if you read Article 1, the purposes of the United Nations Charter, you'll see principles that make sense, a lot of sense, as part of the bedrock of international relations, things that everyone here would agree with. You know, the importance of peace and security, the need to preserve international law, all of these things. But in the San Francisco Conference of 1945, which adopted a bunch of amendments to the Charter, they ruined everything. And they adopted a bunch of principles, such as, for example, an absolute prohibition on the use of force, regardless the merits or need of the particular case, unless you have a Security Council resolution under Chapter 7, or unless an armed attack occurs under Article 51, that don't make any sense. Another principle that doesn't make any sense is Article 2.7, which says that nothing in the present charter shall, allow the interference in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of a member state. And that principle of non-interference in the affairs of a sovereign nation, when you combine it with the criteria of recognition for the sovereignty of a state, which just asks, are these diplomats, do you speak for your country? The only thing you need to know is whether they speak for a group of people that controls the territory of that country. And when you combine these principles together, what it means is that we automatically recognize, under the United Nations system, we recognize the sovereign legitimacy of whatever group of murderers in chief happen to show up in New York, from Togo or whatever country you like. It's a fantastically anti-democratic principle. And it ought to be undermined, among other things, by our founding documents. I mean, if you read the Declaration of Independence, what is the Declaration of Independence? The Declaration of Independence is an indictment on the basis of John Locke's Second Treatise of Government of the tyranny of George III. And if you've read John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, you know that in John Locke's mind, a tyranny and a foreign occupation were equivalent. What is that? It's a state of no government. It's a state of tyranny. And the people have a right to a government properly so called, and that means self-government. And when you don't have self-government, you have a right of rebellion. When you don't have self-government, whatever entity is in charge is intrinsically illegitimate. So if you're looking at a regime like Syria and you're asking yourself, first of all, what do we have a right to do unilaterally or with a coalition of the willing or with our partners, you have to ask yourself, first of all, if you're looking at a legitimate regime to begin with. And you know in the case of the Assad regime in Syria that you are not looking at a legitimate regime. And recognizing the sovereignty, the solemn sovereign diplomatic dignity of a regime like that is a farce. And American diplomacy needs to say so. And Western diplomats need to say so. The regime in Syria is not illegitimate because it's killing civilians. It's the fact that an illegitimate regime is killing civilians is what turns it into a war crime, right? Because in a civil war, civilians are going to die. Civilians got killed in the American Civil War, right? And the difference in Syria is not that civilians are getting killed by a military government, it's that they're getting killed by a tyrant. And so therefore, not only do we have a right to intervene, we have a duty to intervene. And we have the duty to do whatever is necessary to stop the killing going on. Now, the arguments that you hear on the other side, well, if we arm the rebels, it could be worse, more people could get killed. Okay, fine. That's then in the realm of what are we going to do and what the practical consequences are of various courses of action and various strategies. But do we have a right to arm the rebels? Yes, we do. Do we have a right to launch cruise missiles at the defense ministry? Do we have a right to assume a position of armed intervention if they don't stop attacking civilians? Yes, we do. I mean, so far the most, and it's embarrassing, frankly, from a conservative's point of view, that the most, shall we say, vigorous, forceful proposals of what to do are coming from Anne-Marie Slaughter, you know, and people like that on the left, publishing in the New York Times. And what is she proposing? Did you read this? This was in the New York Times just in the last week or two. She's proposing the creation of safe havens that would be guaranteed by, you know, some kind of multinational Air Force presence or something. And it's very important that they not attack Syrian troops unless they enter the safe havens. So stop me when this sounds familiar, right? I mean, this is exactly the idea that led to the massacres at Srebrenica, when there was a safe haven under Danish troops, not under air cover, but under troops that were actually on the ground. And Serbian paramilitary forces showed up, told the Danish commander to order his troops, or Dutch commander, I forget which, to order his troops to strip down to their underwear, while they removed everybody from the camp that was in the safe haven, separated the men from the women, and took the men, loaded them on buses, took them out to a mass grave, and shot them all. This is where safe havens leads. And embarrassingly, from the conservative point of view, it's the most vigorous proposal that we've had on the table so far. You know, apparently you know, John Kerry, who's touching and tragic friendship with Bashar Assad. I guess their wives don't talk anymore, aren't going to go shopping in Paris anymore. Apparently, even Senator Kerry has become increasingly a proponent of a forceful stance. And that's something that we really need to think about and get straight, I think, as conservatives, is first of all, what do we have a right to do? Why do we have a right to intervene? And second of all, what is it that we should do? Because there's an emergency going on there, and while we you know, twiddle our thumbs trying to think of something to do, we're building the same legacy for ourselves that Warren Christopher and Clinton's administration built while people were getting massacred in Serbia. I understand, I agree that this, you know, questions of American interest, people in Yugoslavia who opposed intervention in Yugoslavia had a legitimate point, that intervening in Yugoslavia didn't advance American interests. I'll tell you one thing. There is not a single thing you could do in the Middle East practically that would advance American interests more than the downfall of the Assad regime. That would solve all kinds of problems, right? It would accomplish one thing in particular. Harkening back to, and I spoke about this a little bit last time I spoke at a CSP lunch. When Kissinger was Secretary of State, he expressed scandalously at the time, in 1972 I think it was, he said, the object of US policy is to expel Soviet military influence from Egypt. And the reason why he insisted on that was that he realized that as long as the Egyptians thought they could get what they wanted from Soviet weapons, that there would never be peace between Israel and Egypt. As long as they thought they could get what they wanted from confrontation instead of making peace and a negotiated solution, there would never be peace. And that's why it was necessary to expel the pernicious Soviet influence from the Middle East. Well, where's Hamas getting its weapons? Iran. Why are the moderates on the Palestinian side constantly undercut by a very strengthened terrorist wing because of Iranian influence? Where's Hezbollah getting its weapons? Iran. 30,000 rockets aimed right at the heart of Israel. And when you think about the Hezbollah situation, for example, if the regime in Damascus falls, even if it falls into the hands of an unsavory regime, an undemocratic regime, as long as that regime is not allied to Iran, what's going to happen is that Hezbollah will be isolated. And if Hezbollah is isolated, it's going to completely reverse the deterrent logic that you see right now. Right now, if Israel and Hezbollah get into a fight, Hezbollah can fire 30,000 rockets at Israel, and if Israel decides to invade Lebanon, Hezbollah would be in a lot of trouble. But as long as the Assad regime is there, if you look at a map, the Assad regime is the entire Lebanese border to the east and the entire Lebanese border to the north is Syria. As long as that regime is there, and as long as that regime can't be touched, Hezbollah has strategic depth. It has more strategic depth than Israel does. And so therefore, the deterrence logic is on Hezbollah's side. Now, if Hezbollah loses its source of missiles, if Hezbollah loses that strategic depth in Syria, then the deterrent logic switches to Israel's side. Last time I was in Israel, I spoke with a former head of the Mossad who told me, if Israel and Hezbollah get into another war, it won't be like 2006. I'm not going to imitate his accent, but it's really impressive when an Israeli says this. It's not going to be like the 2006 war. Our response will be so devastating that they will never recover. Well, as long as the Assad regime is standing in Syria, that involves some amount of wishful thinking. But if the Assad regime falls, Hezbollah's got to know that if they get into a fight with Israel, they will not recover from the fight. They will not recover from the response. They've proven that they're an existential threat to Israel. Now that they've proven that, they can expect a devastating response. So, keeping in mind, to summarize on the Syria situation, what do we have a right to do in Syria? Whatever we want. That regime has no sovereign, legitimate rights. We don't have to worry about United Nations sanction. There's no, why are we concerned with China's opinion on the legitimacy of the Syrian regime? This is none of China's business at all. And even from the Russian point of view, I'm sorry that the days of we missed the days of the Soviet Empire compared to what we have to fight now. And I'm sure it's held, the days of Stalin and Khrushchev are held with some nostalgia now in Moscow. But what is Syria now? Syria is not, it doesn't advance Russian interests. It's just a weapons client. That's all it is. And so, it's none of China's business. And to the extent Russia has an opinion, we don't care what their opinion is. There's a humanitarian crisis in Syria. We have a right to intervene. We have arguably a duty to intervene. And very few policies in the Middle East would advance U.S. interests more than intervening in Syria. So that's the sort of global, set of considerations I think people should take into account when they're thinking what to do about Syria. Another couple of words about Iran. The need to expel Iranian influence from the Eastern Mediterranean in order to isolate Hamas, isolate Hezbollah, and set the Islamic Revolution on the trajectory to its final days, right? On the trajectory to finally ending. It should be a paramount goal of the United States. And it may not seem like it may not seem like something that's achievable in the near term, but it is achievable. And it will happen sooner or later. And until it happens, there's not going to be a peace process because the extension of the Iranian Revolution outside of Iran is too strengthening to the extremists among the Palestinians and in Lebanon and throughout the Middle East. So putting that revolution back in its box would solve a great many problems for us. What will create an even worse situation than we have now is if Iran gets nuclear weapons. because if Iran gets nuclear weapons, it will extend the life of the revolution, and it will dramatically strengthen the extensions of Iranian power outside of Iran. If Iran gets nuclear weapons, Hezbollah will be able to attack Israel with much more impunity than it can now. The regime in Bahrain, which is a majority Shiite country, will be threatened. If the regime in Bahrain falls through Iranian subversion, the regime in Saudi Arabia could be threatened. I mean, an Iranian nuclear weapon could turn the entire situation in the Middle East upside down. If you think it looks bad now, just consider what would happen when all of a sudden regimes like in Saudi Arabia are fighting for their lives, and in Bahrain. It could be infinitely worse than it is now. And on the Iran situation, a couple more points. Again, the logic of deterrence, and I'm really glad that people are finally talking about how we deter Iran from getting nuclear weapons, which is the issue that we should have been talking about years ago. Because, you know, when you hear the Pentagon, and be really wary. I mean, I have the deepest reverence for our nation's military and for the generals, but there's a very long-standing pattern, psychological pattern at the Pentagon, which is when everyone at the Pentagon, all the officers at the Pentagon, the senior officers, are a group of people who have never been in a war, they're ready to fight. And when the group of people who are in charge at the Pentagon have been in a war, the last thing they want is another headache. And so you can expect, after 10 years of war, that when you ask the military brass, hey guys, what are our options on Iran? They're going to come back with 50 reasons why we don't have any options on Iran. And you know what? We need a leader. The principle of civilian control of the military is essential to the survival of our republic. And when you have the military in a mood where they don't want to fight anymore, sometimes you have to be willing to tell them, you know what? That's too bad. We've got a situation here. We're not going to minimize short-term risks, well, in order to maximize long-term ones. We can't afford to do that. So we need to come back with options on Iran. We need to establish a deterrent threat. If you're telling us that Iran with nuclear weapons can be deterred, then you're telling us that Iran is a rational actor. If you're telling us that Iran is a rational actor, you're telling us that they can be deterred now. So if they can be deterred now, let's deter them now. Rather than telegraphing that we're not going to attack, which is inviting them to proceed to a nuclear weapons capability, let's deter them now. And, you know, what they're going to do in retaliation, that's a matter of strategic analysis, escalation dominance, all of that. But if you believe in America's ability to deter Iran, let's start deterring them now. And by the way, and so just a final word on why Iran with the nuclear weapons will be so dangerous. Let's assume that it's true, that the threat of an Iranian nuclear missile can be deterred. Maybe that's true. And a nuclear missile, when you fire off a nuclear missile, everyone's going to know who did it. But if Iran delivers through one of its, apparently they don't make Hezbollah operatives the way they used to, because these guys keep getting caught now. But let's say that they're able to find some operatives who are particularly adept, and they trust them with a suitcase bomb, and that bomb goes off in Atlanta, Georgia. Our forensics experts would be able to say, this wasn't a Russian weapon. They might be able to say it wasn't a Chinese weapon, but they would not be able to tell you with certainty that the weapon came from Iran as opposed to Pakistan, for example, right? If the nuclear system that produced both of the weapons is essentially the same, they won't be able to tell you where it came from. And if you can deliver a nuclear weapon with plausible deniability that you're the one who did it, the deterrence calculus becomes much more difficult. And even more important, even more important is the counter-deterrent effect of a nuclear weapon, right? If Hezbollah starts firing rockets at Israel, and maybe we don't even know for sure that Iran has nuclear weapons, but they might have nuclear weapons, our range of options, Israel's range of options, becomes much more constrained, and correspondingly, Iran and Hezbollah's range of options become much wider. And that's not a situation that you can control through deterrence, because actually in that situation, they're defeating our deterrence through their nuclear capabilities, or even through the possibility that they might have nuclear capabilities. So, long story short, this is, I hope I didn't paint too rosy of a picture. But, you know, we've got a situation in the Middle East that, as bad as it is, is going to require us to be brave and bold and to think hard and make hard choices. The situation in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Iran, these are all interconnected. At the end of the day, it's all about the Islamic Revolution. At the end of the day, it's all about doing what we can to weaken the Islamic Revolution and to bring it to an end as rapidly as possible. And that should be our objective. That should be the objective of U.S. policy, and hopefully in the years ahead, we'll see that become a unifying principle of U.S. policy. Thank you very much, and
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Dan, have we got a microphone for Dan?
So if you have time, 2 questions. First, it seems like in the argument that's developing between Israel and the United States, one of the biggest questions is whether we stop Iran when it gets a nuclear capability or when they make the decision to produce a weapon. From the way you talked, it sounds like the capability, in your view, is just as bad as the nuclear weapon. Is the thinking in the American government really, amongst the administration, that the nuclear capability is acceptable if they don't make a decision to proceed? And unrelated, but second question, I'll just give it now, is you almost implied that General Dempsey's comments about the rationality of Iran is widely shared at the Pentagon. Should we read that comment as just reflecting what his political masters have said, or is that really generally held in the defense community?
No, I think that the military believes what it believes, and the administration believes what it believes for different reasons. And when they happen to believe the same thing, it's for different reasons. Unfortunately, they happen to believe the same thing right now. The question about whether Iran is a rational actor is sort of artificial. When the Soviet Empire was at the height of its revolutionary stridency and absolutism was under Stalin. Stalin was a rational actor. I mean, Stalin was very rational. He tried to talk Kim Il-sung out of invading South Korea twice, and it was only when the U.S. withdrew its garrison of 40,000 troops from South Korea that Stalin finally became convinced that it might work, and even still, he didn't want to become involved. So, a revolution that's in what Peter Rodman called its exuberant phase has a lot to lose, and people don't want to risk it, but they want to win. And the revolution in Iran now has to be worried, in its 30th year, having been successful nowhere outside of Iran except Lebanon, has to start worrying that if it doesn't start winning, it's going to start losing. So the fact that Iran is a rational actor is not an argument for Iran being less dangerous or less deterrable than it would be if they were insane, right? And if you think that they're insane, then all the more if you don't think that they're a rational actor, then all the more reason to prevent them from getting nuclear weapons. So and I'm sorry, what the first question was?
About the capability.
Oh, yeah. So that question is rather in the nature of, if somebody's holding a gun to your head, are we going to require evidence that they've decided to pull the trigger before you defend yourself? Do you think that makes sense as a rule? I mean, it's like somebody's holding a gun to my head, but, I shouldn't really elbow him because I don't know he's decided to pull the trigger yet. Okay, so General Dempsey's point is well taken. They haven't decided to build a bomb. They don't have to decide to build a bomb if they decided to build all the components of a bomb, and they clearly have decided to do that, right? And they didn't allow the second team of IAEA inspectors to visit Iran in the last 3 weeks, tried again to get into the military facility at Parchin. Why do they want to get into the military facility at Parchin? Because we know that the Iranians are conducting high explosives tests necessary for nuclear warhead detonation. We know it. And we want to see the facilities. And the Iranians say, you know what, you don't have no reason to go in there. So now we think we know that they're conducting warhead. And by the way, the 2007 NIE, and Ed might remember the great reaction that some of us had. I was Senate RPC when that one came down. I think I sent out like 7 emails in the first 24 hours after that NIE came down. And it said, basically the great error of the 2007 NIE is that it presumed that everything that was dual use was not for a weapons purpose, right? And the IAEA has to assume the same thing, the way that it's structured now and the criteria that it uses now. It shows up and it says, well, this is a civilian program, so we can't certify that it's a diversion for weapons use. But what they're doing at Parchin is a diversion for weapons use. high explosives testing for the detonation of a warhead obviously has no civilian application. So, you know, they're doing the weaponization, they're developing the delivery vehicles, and they're doing not just enrichment, but also hard water in a plutonium reactor. So they're not just doing everything they need to develop a serial production capability for nuclear weapons. They're developing, it's not just a nuclear weapons program, it's 2 nuclear weapons programs. It's a plutonium and a uranium enrichment pathway, right? Yeah, and so they're clearly doing, when Congressman Paul says that there's no evidence that the Iranians are developing nuclear weapons, with all due respect, he doesn't know what he's talking about. The evidence is everything about their nuclear program is evidence that they're developing nuclear weapons. So we know that they're developing nuclear weapons, that they've decided they don't have to make the final decision until they've assembled all the components. But they're assembling all the components, that's for sure. And if we wait until, the reason why it's ridiculous to wait until we know they've decided to develop a nuclear weapon is that once we have evidence of that, it'll be too late to stop them. That's why we have to stop them now.
We're running a little late right now.
I think we have time for one more
Okay,
question.
let's take one more question. Sarah?
Sarah Stern, Endowment for Middle East Truth. It sounds to me like all the elements are put together for a perfect storm. And we know that the American populace is exhausted after 2 wars, or we're still executing one in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think most of us in this room know that there are Hezbollah cells in Central America and even some right here within the United States. And I think it would behoove people to make the argument that once Iran passes the nuclear threshold, Ahmadinejad would just have to give a wink and a nod to Sheikh Nasrallah of Hezbollah, and we ourselves will be at risk. Because unfortunately, there are many, many people who just don't see that this is an American.
Terrorist organizations is something that our national security establishment still has not come up with a doctrine to address, and against which we're going to have to fight norms of general acceptance in the UN Charter among our own partners and allies in order to get any sensible doctrine accepted. And that's why, you know, that's one reason, Ed, that something to look forward here in the year ahead is that the State Department's Office of Legal Advisors ought to be politicized. Those appointments should be political appointments, because what the legal advisors do now is they tell the Secretary of State what international law is right now. What international law is right now under the UN Charter is a disaster. If those principles are applied to prevent us from adopting sensible policies, what we're adhering to is a suicidal set of rules. And what we need is a collection of lawyers at the State Department that are going to tell the President and the State Department and the Secretary of State how we can change norms of international behavior and change norms of international acceptance, not so that we can do whatever we want. I mean, I don't believe in the principle of unilateralism according to no principles at all. The principles according to which we act are legitimate. People should know what they are in advance. We shouldn't keep trying to pretend to adhere to the law of the UN Charter when those rules are stupid and make no sense. And so I think that's the challenge ahead.
Mario, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great report.